Does he list his favorite band?
White Stripes?
That's funny.
What?
He told everyone in class today his favorite band was Blink-182.
Dude, let's trash this place. After we get paid. Nice.
Hey guys, RanterInShades here, exercise my first amendment rights vlog style, and it's time for another episode of What's Wrong With.
What's wrong with me? You wanna know what's wrong with me? I can ask you the exact same thing. What's wrong with me?
This is going to be the most interesting video I've made for this series. Why? Because unlike the case with all the other bands I've discussed in this series, with the exception of the Blood on the Dance Floor one I did for April Fool's the one time, but that should be a given, Blink-182, the subject of today's video, is actually a band I used to not like. So when we get to the debunking the flack portion of this video, I'll be partially speaking from experience about the problems I used to have with them, and explaining why that's no longer representative of my current views. For now, I'll talk about what it was that got my opinion to turn around on them. I believe it was that clip from The Simpsons I played at the beginning where I first heard of them. Back then, when I was first dipping my feet in the water with my rock and metal exploration around 2007 when I was in middle school, the way I would get into a band would have me buying their 2 to 3 most popular songs on iTunes, if their music was available there, listening to them, and if I liked what I heard, I would aim to... In the case of Blink-182, or Blink as I'll be calling them throughout this video, those songs were Damn It and All the Small Things. I thought Damn It was fine enough, it had a pretty catchy riff. All the Small Things, however, was not clicking with me, and if I'm to be honest, it's still not a song I really like that much. So Blink became a band I discarded at that time. Wonderful use of $2 that was. I should also mention that back then, I was not the big-time pop-punk connoisseur that I am now. Sure, there were bands from the genre I liked, like Green Day, Sum 41, My Chemical Romance, and even Simple Plan, but much of the other bands considered essential in pop-punk weren't clicking with me the way the metal and hard rock bands I was getting exposed to through Guitar Hero were. I even mentioned this fact in my second metal elitist video, What's With the Emo/Scene Hate. That video mainly centered around questioning the issues the metal community had with people part of the emo/scene subculture enjoying or even creating metal and being a part of that culture as well. The video wasn't made from the perspective of someone incredibly invested in pop punk or emo, but it wasn't long after that video when punk in general was becoming a bigger fixture in my music collection. This led me to eventually upload an amendment to the What's With the Emo/Scene Hate video 3 years later in 2016 entitled, I'm Shades and I Love Pop Punk. The environment I was in college definitely contributed to this development in my music taste, but another thing that helped in that regard was my adventures with the band I played in at the time, Gardens of Acadia. Side note before I continue, a number of people have asked me what happened to a video I used to have on my channel talking about this band that's no longer public, and the reason for that is not only because it's a chapter of my life I kind of want closed, but I mentioned a member of the band that would soon after that video get kicked out for reasons I'd rather not get into here, and I didn't want to give him any positive promotion. Figured I'd set the record straight there. Anyway, what does this have to do with Blink-182? Hey, that rhymes. Well, our last drummer, James, was big into Blink. I'm pretty sure they were his favorite band, and he was heavily influenced musically by Travis Barker. There was one day I remember when he was warming up and he decided to play from memory Blink's song M&M's from their debut album Cheshire Cat, ironically an album Travis doesn't play on, as it's one of the band's fastest songs, if not the fastest. For context, this is what the song sounds like. A big thing that I love about pop punk is the energetic drumming, and just hearing James play that double time beat, or blast beat as I like calling it, even without any further context as to what the song sounds like, was enough to make me go, wait, why don't I like this band again? And that was what got me to give Blink another chance, and they clicked a lot better with me this time around than they did in 2007, with M&M's becoming my favorite song of theirs. I'm pretty sure it's Tucker Carlson's least favorite. It made perfect sense for Blink to finally be welcomed into my collection, since pop punk had become one of my main favorite genres of music. Even when I didn't like Blink's music, I always had an understanding of their importance to the genre and its development in the late 90s, which we'll get into right now. Ask yourself this: who was the band that popularized pop punk? Many people cite the Ramones as the band that invented the style, since they were not only punky, thuggish, and rebellious, but they knew how to write some catchy tunes and utilized poppy chord progressions and adhered to a pop structure like Blitzkrieg Bop and I Want to Be Sedated, even though that has the worst guitar solo I've ever heard, even if it does work harmonically. Others cite the Descendants as being the first band of the genre, since a lot of what we know as pop punk can trace back to them. But not only do I see their sound as having more in common with 80s hardcore and post-hardcore, they've never struck me as being nearly as popular. I don't deny for a second both bands' influence, but I've never really been someone that likes associating pop punk with the 70s and 80s, and mainly see it as becoming a thing by the late 80s, early 90s. According to the Pop Punk Smart playlist in my iTunes, the oldest album in that collection is The Offspring's hardcore-tinged self-titled debut from 1989. Along with them, you had other punk bands reach a modicum of popularity at the time, like the Misfits, the Dead Kennedys, NoFX, and Bad Religion. But the band that I truly believe popularized pop punk, and arguably even punk as a whole, is Green Day, who I've discussed in a previous video in this series. Their major label debut from 1994, Doogie, is a landmark moment in the history of punk. With big songs like Basket Case, She, When I Come Around, Longview, and Welcome to Paradise, the album was wildly successful, and helped to further the pivot away from styles associated with the 80s that grunge, alternative rock, and alternative metal influenced earlier in the 90s. But Shades, this video wasn't about Green Day. You've already done a What's Wrong With video on them. Why are you talking about them here? Because it was thanks in large part to Green Day's rise in popularity that more pop-punk bands were able to follow in their wake by the late 90s. Bands like the previously mentioned Offspring, Newfound Glory, Bowling for Soup, Jimmy Eat World, and of course,
Blink-182?
Yes, Blink-182. By the end of the 90s, Green Day and Blink were basically neck and neck, like the Beatles and Rolling Stones of pop punk, that everyone had their own preference for which one they preferred. I'm personally more partial to Green Day since they made an everlasting impact on my music taste as an elementary schooler, and are still a band I consider an all-time favorite. But Blink's popularity by the end of the decade is not something to ignore, especially when you consider their influence. Like Green Day, Blink are a power trio from California that started out with a different drummer. The three people that come immediately to mind when thinking of the band are Tom DeLonge on guitar and vocals, Mark Hoppus on bass and vocals, and Travis Barker on drums. Their first two albums featured their original drummer, Scott Raynor, who was also in the band when they cameoed in American Pie as the band having their practice while watching the webcam broadcast of Jim attempting to get it on with Nadia. Their debut album, Cheshire Cat, that I mentioned earlier, is the album that's known as being the most raw and punky album in their discography, compared to the more polished stuff they would come out with later, so it's not as remembered. But if you're someone that likes their pop punk to sound fast and gritty, I'd recommend it. In addition to M&M's, my favorite song of Blink's, other great tracks on the album include Carousel, Touchdown Boy, Strings, TV, and Wasting Time. Their second album, Dude Ranch from 1997, is my favorite of their albums, as it functions as the bridging gap between the rawness of Cheshire Cat and the poppier punk albums that would follow. You can tell they're leaning more in that direction, but not losing too much of the energy from their first album, so I've always felt it worked better. Thanks in large part to Damn it! Blink started making waves with the release of this album, and along with that, you had tracks like Pathetic, Dick Lips, Apple Shampoo, Josie, Degenerate, and Lemmings. After some rigorous touring, Scott Raynor had been doing some heavy drinking, which led to Tom and Mark firing him, and replacing him was the man that would become the face of the band, Travis Barker. Like I said, Dude Ranch is my favorite Blink-182 album, though most people will tell you that their third album, and first with Travis Barker in the band, 1999's Enema of the State, is not just their favorite, but also the band's best. I've always believed that sentiment came from the fact that it's Blink's most commercially successful album, containing many of their most popular songs. What's My Age Again, Adam's Song, Don't Leave Me, Anthem, and of course, All the Small Things. If Dookie was the breakout album for pop punk, Enema of the State is the album that ushered in the era of the genre lovingly referred to by Finn McKenty as TRL core.
TRL, baby!
TRL, or Total Request Live, was an MTV countdown show that ran from 1998 to 2008 and featured lots of live performances, interviews, and showcased the most viewer-requested music videos of the time, becoming a major vehicle for a song and artist's popularity. MTV tends to be seen by some demographics of people as a corporation that commodified music and shilled for only the mega pop stars, but much like Headbangers Ball with metal in the late 80s, you'd be surprised at the number of rock bands, many of which being pop punk, and even some metal bands that got much of their exposure thanks to being featured on TRL, with some even managing to hit #1 on the show. Blink-182 is the band that's treated as the most representative band of that era. I tend to view Enema of the State as a somewhat over-glorified pop-punk album, but much like what Green Day's popularity did for bands like Blink in the 90s, the popularity of this album rang in what could be considered a new era for pop-punk, with many bands at the time helping to define one of the most quintessential sounds of the early 2000s. Without Enema of the State, it's doubtful bands like Sum 41, Yellowcard, Alkaline Trio, Reliant K, and Simple Plan would have risen in the ranks in the beginning part of the decade.
JC Sum and Blink and MXPX rockin' my room.
That's why it's hard for me to really think much negatively about this album, even if I still don't find All the Small Things to be that great of a song. Plus, it's not like tracks like Aliens Exist, Going Away to College, The Party Song, Mutt, and Wendy Clear are anything worth ignoring. There's actually a pop-punk band from Texas that a friend recommended to me once that have a couple free EPs available on Bandcamp called Wendy Clear, and it should be obvious where they got their name from. As far as the post-Raynor Blink albums go, I've always had a preference for their next album from 2001, Take Off Your Pants and Jacket. Please don't do that now, I don't think anyone wants to see that. On the note of that lovely play on words there, that brand of raunchy humor and immaturity was another big thing Blink represented, and I don't mean that as an insult. When you think of punk rock, you think of loud, brash musicians rebelling against an oppressive power structure. Punk purists tend to view bands that manage to become successful in the mainstream as sellouts to their cause, which I of course talked about in my Rage Against the Machine video and somewhat in my Green Day video. Punk is typically outspokenly liberal, with bands railing against conservative politicians and the capitalist system at large. So is it betraying the movement to not do that? In the Rage Against the Machine video, I countered this idea by not only bringing up the Tukukwe fallacy, which refers to the idea that hypocrisy makes one wrong, even though that's not how hypocrisy actually works, but I also used this clip to explain why a band as outspokenly anti-capitalist as them would utilize the very machine they're raging against to further their message.
If you can't beat 'em, show 'em.
That's capitalism for you, I guess.
What these people fail to realize is that punk also refers to a particular attitude. Punk doesn't just mean railing against the establishment, it also means just being yourself and not giving a fuck what society thinks. In a way, you're still rallying against something bringing you down. Blink-182 were most certainly open about what their sense of humor was, and that humor definitely fit that rowdy, don't-give-a-fuck aspect of what it means to be punk. Kinda like in a Filthy Frank video, they fucked around like teenagers and were unapologetic about it in the most endearing way. For fuck's sake, these guys played naked on stage in a manner akin to what the Red Hot Chili Peppers had done before them, and made a song about wanting to fuck a dog in the ass that causes PETA to wake up in a cold sweat every night. Antics like these were emblematic of that obnoxious, edgy attitude of pop punk in the late 90s, early 2000s. This theme is also represented by this moment on their live album, The Mark, Tom, and Travis Show, at the end of their song, The Country Song.
Shut your fucking face, Uncle Fucker.
Always nice when my favorite song from the South Park movie gets some love. Anyway, after Dude Ranch, Take Off Your Pants and Jacket is my second favorite of Blink's albums, and Enema of the State my third. If Dude Ranch is the bridging gap between the raw tone on Cheshire Cat and the polish of Enema of the State, then Take Off Your Pants and Jacket is the bridging gap between Enema of the State and their next releases in terms of songwriting. It's the album where Blink started veering in a more serious direction, while still retaining the juvenile attitude they were known for, which I always thought made for a little better of a pop-punk album. Then again, this is the album Fuck a Dog and Grandpa song come from, so they were still very much in touch with their inner dumb kid. I also see a good bit more instrumental competence on this album, and again, more effort all around thanks to songs like Online Songs, First Date, Happy Holidays You Bastard, a song I wish I had thought to include in my Christmas songs video, Stay Together for the Kids, Roller Coaster, Every Time I Look for You, and of course, The Rock Show. The self-titled, or untitled album, kinda depicted here on my shirt, is the album of Blink's classic discography that's seen as the emo record. The year is 2003, and emo is in its beginning stages of becoming a mainstream phenomenon. Bands like Taking Back Sunday, The Used, and My Chemical Romance had released their debut albums just a year prior, and this was the direction alternative music appeared to be headed in. It also helped that another thing that happened in between Take Off Your Pants and Jacket and the self-titled, when the band took a short break in wake of tour date cancellations following the 9/11 attacks, was Tom DeLonge forming a side project with Travis and David Kennedy of Hazen Street called Boxcar Racer, taking heavy influence from the 90s post-hardcore band Quicksand. This was a project that had Tom channeling his creative and personal frustrations into in a way that he hadn't done with Blink. Needless to say, when the band later reconvened, a lot more outside-the-box influences were coming into the picture on the self-titled, both musically and lyrically, which helped make this perhaps their most interesting album to date. I don't love the album as much as the last three, but it's got a lot going for it. It's got more of Blink's recognizable songs like I Miss You, Stockholm Syndrome, Not a Muse cover, and Feeling This, along with Obvious, Go, Easy Target, Here's Your Letter, and even a track that features everyone's favorite goth man,
Robert Smith of The Cure!
doing some backing vocals, all of this as my other favorite tracks on the album. As I kind of implied in that last paragraph, this part of the 2000s was a strange time for Blink. With everything leading up to that hiatus and reconvening with the self-titled, the three men felt like they were going in different directions and wanting different things for the band. And whenever friction like this takes place within a band, that's usually when the members decide to either break up or go on hiatus, which is exactly what ended up happening with Blink in 2005. Following this, Tom formed a spacey alternative rock band called Angels and Airwaves, while Mark and Travis formed an emo pop-punk band called Plus 44, one of my favorite one-and-done bands. I'm a little more partial to Plus 44 than I am Angels and Airwaves, since they appeal to me more on a stylistic level, but the thing I always appreciated about Angels and Airwaves is that it made for an interesting showcasing of Tom's creativity in a different way than what we got with Boxcar Racer, whereas Plus 44's one and only album, When Your Heart Stops Beating, felt like a classic Blink album that I like to think of as being what the band would have likely come out with after Take Off Your Pants and Jacket had the post-hardcore influences not been implemented in their sound. This wasn't the only abnormal thing that happened in this time parameter. Travis Barker had pursued some solo ventures and other projects later in the 2000s, and in 2008 was involved in a plane crash that resulted in his skin essentially being burned, with him needing to spend a long period of time at the hospital to heal. I think he was actually in a full body cast at one point, but I could very well be misremembering. What I do remember was a drummer friend of mine talking with me on Facebook at the time about this, and I remember him being worried shitless. Even while I hadn't yet been won over by Blink, I really felt for Travis's situation because it really unsettled me. He was thankfully able to heal and return to drumming by the end of the year, and this ultimately led to him reuniting with Tom and Mark in 2009. There was a good deal of hype for their next album, Neighborhoods, from 2011 because of all this. I remember around this time, Muse Productions did a review of the top 10 singles on Billboard's rock chart, and the album's lead single, Up All Night, not to be confused with Slaughter's song of the same name, was included, along with names like Foster the People with Pumped Up Kicks, Rise Against with Make It Stop September's Children, Nickelback with Bottoms Up, Red Hot Chili Peppers with Adventures of Rain Dance Maggie, and of course, the Jesus Band with Walk at the #1 spot where it belongs. Hearing the song in that video, I look back at this as being an early sign that my perspective of Blink might be changing a little, because it sounded like there was more musicality there than I tended to associate with them. These days, Neighborhoods is an album I see the fanbase being kind of mixed on, feeling like it didn't quite meet expectations, but I think it's a solid enough effort. Natives, Hearts All Gone, Kaleidoscope, This Is Home, and MH418 2011 would be my favorites on the album. I've managed to go this deep into the video without talking about Mark, Tom, and Travis as musicians. I've always seen Blink's main strengths lying in their catchy writing and their fun-loving attitude and vibe that makes you feel like a kid growing up in the 90s and 2000s, but that doesn't mean the musicianship isn't there. Mark Hoppus's bass playing is seen as some of the more melodic in the genre, with some of my favorite of his bass moments being on songs like Carousel, Josie, and Dumpweed that show him getting busier and more syncopated. Along with his catchy sensibilities, Tom DeLonge adds his own hooky parts in his guitar playing. One big thing that he helped to popularize is open string riffs and alternate picked string skips like on What's My Age Again. In addition to when he employs some aggressive palm muting, his riffs are also known to be bouncy, which have also become a major staple in pop punk. And I also like how he plays a hollow body guitar, which is something that isn't associated much with punk unless you're a rockabilly punk band like The Living End. Travis Barker, though, is who I've believed for the longest time to be the main talent of the band. Even when I wasn't a fan of Blink-182, I recognized him as being where much of the talent lied in. I mean, I guess there's a reason he's one of the playable artist characters in Guitar Hero World Tour. There are a number of fast and hard-hitting drummers in pop punk, one of which being Blink's original drummer Scott Raynor, but there's something about the energy he brings that really helps to make Blink's music distinct from the rest of the pack. He might not play on my favorite of Blink's albums, but a large part of what makes Enema of the State, Take Off Your Pants and Jacket, and the self-titled so special of albums is his drumming. The double time beats, the pulse in the hi-hat, the 16th note beats, the eclectic fills, all these tropes that are seen as core aspects of pop punk drumming are associated heavily with Travis. I even associate setting your cymbals up really high with him. But in addition to that, he's the person I see as being the face of the band. Tom and Mark were also good-looking, charismatic characters that drew media focus, but much like Pete Wentz was with Fall Out Boy, despite not being the lead vocalist, it's Travis that's the character at the forefront, for better or worse. But now I think it's time to look at what gets people to say, and debunk the flag. Probably a bit generic to be a Mark Hoppus impression, but hey. I suppose a good place to start would be with what happened next in the story after Neighborhoods. 2015 saw Tom DeLonge leaving the band again when the rift between he and the other two reopened. He was replaced by Matt Skiba, the vocalist and guitarist in Alkaline Trio, who sang on their two most recent albums, California and 9. Like I said earlier in the video, most people think of Blink-182 as being Mark, Tom, and Travis, so anything different would be troubling to fans, especially when the member being replaced is the lead vocalist. From what I've gathered, the main issue with California and 9 was that they sound more like Alkaline Trio albums with some Blink-182 elements. They strike me as being similar to albums like Gravity by Bullet for My Valentine and You're Welcome by A Day to Remember, and that the albums aren't bad per se, but I imagine they'd be better received if they were made by a different band than one with as distinctive of a sound as Bullet for My Valentine or A Day to Remember. Alkaline Trio was an excellent pop-punk band that reached their stride around the same time Blink did, but the issue I always saw with the Skiba era was that he has a very distinctive voice that you don't really associate much with Blink-182, who themselves had a vocalist with a distinctive voice. Even while Mark Hoppus was still doing his vocal duties, Matt Skiba singing Tom's parts came off to a lot of people as a bit of a mismatch. That said, I remember ARTV giving 9 a pretty glowing review, which surprised me given the backlash the album's debut single Blame It On My Youth received. There may be some bias there, since John has made it known frequently that Blink are one of his all-time favorite bands, but it suggests that maybe there isn't that huge of a stretch between the Skiba albums and the albums they made with Tom. If anything, maybe the album resonates more with people who are big into Alkaline Trio, that variant of pop-punk that leans a little more into alternative rock. They're not for me, but I imagine that being what their appeal is. In any case, after putting much of his focus into Angels and Airwaves, among some other things we'll talk about later, Tom DeLonge rejoined Blink last year to the satisfaction of many a fan. And I remember hearing good things about the set they played at Coachella shortly after. That festival might have a reputation of being for rich normies, but it was a nice indication that the three of them are still able to put on a good show together. Will the three of them stay together for the kids? Don't act like you didn't see that pun coming. Will they do anything more with Matt Skiba, or will he just resume what he was doing with Alkaline Trio? All we can really say to that at this point in time is,
Let's find out.
now, with a classic member rejoining a band comes a reunion tour. And reunion tours are a big deal, especially if you're a band with as major of a legacy as Blink-182. The kinds of venues these tours usually take place at are big stadiums. Big stadium tours usually sell their tickets via Ticketmaster, and these tickets were not cheap at all. It makes that tour they did with Lil Wayne of all people look more appealing by comparison. I've bought some expensive concert tickets before, but never have I paid an amount of money this abhorrent for a ticket, let alone for nosebleed seats. And bear in mind, I'm the same guy that went to 2 major reunion tours last year for Rage Against the Machine and My Chemical Romance. Both of those had me waking up at around 9:30 a.m. back in 2020 before the pandemic to wait in the queue for tickets to officially go on sale so I'd be able to get them before the show inevitably sells out. They both had me spending a triple-digit amount of money like the privileged asshole I am, and even I was floored by the ticket prices for Blink's tour. Very punk there, yes sir. Obviously, there's a huge demand that's being supplied here, and there are people in the world that can afford those kinds of tickets and did buy them, but a part of me still feels flabbergasted just thinking about making that kind of a purchase. It's easy to look at these kinds of outrageous ticket prices and blame the bands, but it isn't really their fault, or at least it isn't solely their fault. In addition to the terrible state of the economy, the problem mainly lies in Ticketmaster and the venues that have their tickets sold through Live Nation, who Ticketmaster is merged with. The service is more or less the ticket, pardon the pun, for a band to be able to play at popular venues. Pearl Jam actually once instigated a lawsuit against Ticketmaster in 1994 because they didn't like the fees that they had in place and tried to boycott Ticketmaster after they unfortunately lost, and as a result of that, they didn't get to play at any large-scale venues at the time that worked with the service. Now that's what I call being a martyr. But that's the problem with Ticketmaster. They sneak in a bunch of fees like their convenience fee or their print-at-home fee. There's also the verified reseller thing that they do as a means of combating scalpers. I see that as having the right intentions, but them essentially acting as their own scalpers doesn't do anything to solve the issue of ticket prices being
Too damn high.
Inflation is also a thing, but I am not an expert at all on this subject, so all I'll say is that it is a thing. I look at what Ticketmaster is doing as being part of what I like to call the Michael Eisner effect. Michael Eisner was the CEO of the Walt Disney Company from 1984 to 2005, and he came up with the idea of raising the price of admission at Disneyland to stupid amounts because people will just pay the price anyway because they really want to go to the happiest place on earth. Likewise, people really wanting to go to a particular concert will fork out however much they have to because they want to see that band, especially since you never know when their next tour is going to be, or if there's even going to be one at all. Whenever I'm searching for tickets to a show and it takes place at a Live Nation venue, I always try to find whatever alternative I can because I feel so dirty using Ticketmaster, even if the digital ticket shows up in the app anyway. And the only way any kind of boycott can be effective, irrespective of size, is if there is an alternative offering that product. It's obvious wishful thinking, but that's how my mind operates whenever I'm in this position. And whenever I'm unable to find such an alternative and end up swallowing my pride, it doesn't feel nice at all knowing I'm part of the problem. And I'm sure all of you watching who have bought tickets on Ticketmaster in the last few years feel the same way. Maybe in the future there will be more of a competition and Ticketmaster will have less of a monopoly on the market, especially since antitrust legislation is supposed to keep shit like this from happening, right? Teddy Roosevelt must be rolling in his grave. Blink are far from the only band to be having this problem. There was also Taylor Swift's big tour this year that had prices in the 5-digit realm, as well as Bruce Springsteen's tour. Very boss of him, right? This isn't me committing a relative privation fallacy. This is me saying the problem extends far beyond Blink-182. And I would say they and other artists that have tickets to their tours sold through Ticketmaster really take about 20% of the blame, since they are opting into it and not being as transparent about it as they maybe should. Whereas the rest of the blame goes towards the venues, promoters, artist representatives, and of course, the vendor. Another part of me feels like you can't really blame Blink or whichever artist for going the Live Nation route with their tours, because touring makes up a substantial amount of artists' earnings and they're wanting to get the most out of it. After all, this service has historically paid artists, and by association everyone that works with them, 85% of ticket sales. So from the perspective of the artist, this is basically the only choice they really have, which is really depressing to think about. Even Pearl Jam had to bite the bullet after their Ticketmaster boycott wasn't earning them as much of a profit. I'm not wanting to make this into a rant on Ticketmaster, so I'm going to link 2 videos in the description that go into more detail on it. One from the Punk Rock MBA and the other from Mike the Snare, who shines more of a light on Ticketmaster's history to put into perspective how exactly they became the scourge of the live music industry that they are today, as well as what it is that jacks the price up.
news, everyone!
Hey guys, Future Shades here. So while I was editing this video, this news was brought to my attention. I knew that there was an investigation going on against Ticketmaster, especially given what I said a little bit ago in this video about how antitrust legislation is supposed to keep Ticketmaster from doing the kinds of things that they're doing. But I was not expecting to be hearing about this soon after initially hearing about the investigation. Thanks to good old President Biden, it's looking like there aren't going to be any more hidden fees on not just Ticketmaster, but also on other ticket vendor platforms like SeatGeek and all that. So much like when Trump signed the Music Modernization Act back in 2018 that was pushing for fair pay for artists from streaming services, this is looking to be Biden's equivalent of that. That's getting me to go like, yes, thank you. I'm not a fan of either politician, but I like seeing these kinds of moves being made in the music industry that help the world to be a little bit better of a place. So hopefully going forward, tickets won't be as expensive. Like, I'm not expecting them to be cheap by today's standards, but I'm hoping they won't be as expensive. I'm hoping that's what this means. All right, back to the video. How about we backtrack a little to talk about what Tom was up to before rejoining Blink, the lighthearted subject of conspiracy theories. Oh yeah, I'd much rather talk about that than Ticketmaster. So I mentioned earlier that Tom was putting much of his focus into something else in addition to Angels and Airwaves after he had left Blink. What was that something else? UFOs.
I always thought it was hilarious to think of Tom DeLonge standing outside his backyard in the middle of the night, looking up at the sky, looking for aliens and spaceships, shouting, "Where are you?" over and over again. Just that phrase, like he does in the song.
If you think about it, the signs were basically in plain sight, since Blink does have a song called Aliens Exist on Enema of the State, and Angels and Airwaves is known for being space-oriented, so I'm not sure Tom having these kinds of interests should be that much of a surprise. Anyway, he founded a company in 2015 called To the Stars that specializes in investigation of UFOs, building technology for these studies, as well as publication of media related to these subjects. There's a video I remember watching from Armored Skeptic back in 2018 that actually covers Tom and To the Stars Academy, where he mentions a WikiLeaks dump of John Podesta's emails that revealed that Tom actually had contact with the government and military insiders regarding his own findings, and had a book he had written about the subject become of some interest to the White House, allegedly. He even had videos he took released by the Pentagon. Regardless of whether his findings and intentions with To the Stars are legit, which I'm definitely skeptical about, it's honestly pretty astounding that he was able to get this kind of recognition for it. I'll link Armored Skeptic's videos in the description if you want more of a deconstruction of Tom's endeavors here, since I'm not wanting that to be the point of this video either. I will caution though, in part 1 of this little UFO series he did, he refers to Tom as being the bassist of Blink-182.
Mere weeks before this story broke, on a live web stream, Blink-182 bass player Tom DeLonge announced he was creating To the Stars Academy.
It's like you do all this research and you couldn't even get that extremely basic fact right? Come on, man.
Come on.
Is Tom's fascination with UFOs strange? Oh, certainly. Personally, I've always been a bit of an astrophobe due to the vast nature of outer space, and thus never took much interest in astronomy. But the way I've always treated the subject of UFOs and aliens is similar to the way agnostics view God. They're things I'd like to believe could exist somewhere out there, given how vast and expansive the universe is with its multitude of galaxies, even outside the one we inhabit. And if any such physical proof can be provided, I would be delighted to see it. Anyone out there trying to find that proof, best of luck to you. But that's why I can't really find it in me to take that much issue with Tom having this side to him, as these are questions so many scientists have been trying for centuries to find the answers to. Not to mention, believing in UFOs has always come across to me as mild compared to other more egregious conspiracy theories I've seen people peddle, so it's not like Tom is on Kanye levels of conspiratardation. On the note of one of the words that makes up that funny term I coined that I'm sure some humor-lacking, context-ignoring woke scold is going to take out of context, let's shift our focus away from Tom DeLonge and back over to Travis Barker. In recent years, he's become something of an ambassador of pop punk for the next generation through producing and drumming on a number of albums from rappers turned pop punkers. Most notably, he's worked with Kenny, Trippie Redd, Jaden, Lil Huddy, and most infamously of all, Machine Gun Kelly, before he decided, screw you guys, I'm going home. I do actually like the album, or mixtape, he did with Kenny Hoopla, and there are some songs on the first album he worked with MGK on, Tickets to My Downfall, that I think are fairly decent pop punk songs. But I've never been the craziest about a lot of the rappers turned pop punkers, despite how many would argue these people are saving rock music from being dead. It's not because I want to gatekeep them from pop punk on the basis of them being rappers, but because they've never come across to me as doing anything all that interesting with the style, and giving off a vibe like this is more of an aesthetic for them than anything else. My only real issue with Travis working with the rappers turned pop punkers is that it seems like he's the only drummer getting signed on to these projects. Obviously, as stated before, he's a major character in pop punk and an excellent drummer who brings a certain punch and energy to his playing, but even if he really is the most well-known drummer in this genre, it's not like there aren't any other great drummers in pop punk that are just as talented, if not more talented than Travis, that these people could just as easily hit up. But to be fair, this isn't too different from when a band works with a big-name producer like Rick Rubin, or hires a popular songwriter like Desmond Child in the 80s to co-write with in the hopes that they can score a big hit. But the main complaint I see Travis getting regarding this is just for even working with these people at all. As I've said in my Machine Gun Kelly video, I appreciate that these guys can function as gateway artists for younger people to get into pop punk, as well as helping the genre to be Billboard mainstream again, even if I might not be the craziest about these artists myself. And by association, I appreciate that Travis is being forward-thinking and doing his part to assist in the matter, but that's about where my respect begins and ends. My thoughts on MGK are detailed quite thoroughly in that video, so check it out if you haven't seen it. I'm totally in agreement that his music, along with other rappers turned pop punkers, are nothing that special, and that the guy's an immature tool, especially after his beef with Slipknot's Corey Taylor.
So anyway, what's everyone's favorite candy? Reese's Pieces?
But how exactly is any of this the fault of Travis Barker? It's not like he's responsible for MGK like he's his babysitter. Outside of producing, co-writing, and drumming on both of MGK's pop punk albums, the only other thing Travis really did, that I know of anyway, was play messenger for MGK when he was trying to get Corey Taylor on board to provide guest vocals on Tickets to My Downfall, which Corey declined the offer for due to not feeling like he was the right man for the job. That's basically the extent of Travis's role here. What I'm getting at here is this is really more of an MGK issue than an issue with Travis, as well as a lame guilt by association argument. Even if you wanted to argue maybe he could have done something to reel the guy in, just because he's involved with these people doesn't mean he's responsible for them. There are more petty issues that make for common complaints about the music, such as the goofy humor and the supposed over-reliance on na-na-nas in the choruses, that basically boil down to, it's pop punk, what do you expect?
It's got a few oohs and ahs, and it takes a little pause.
But I think now we're at the core of the debunking the flat portion. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that I used to not like Blink-182, and that part of this portion of the video would be explaining what it was that I didn't like about them and why I don't feel that way now. What were those problems? Well, that's a question I've asked myself about a number of artists I used to be dismissive of as a teenager that I would go on to change my mind about. If you've seen the heartfelt video essay I made this year for my 10-year anniversary of making videos known as Just Enjoy Music, I made mention of the fact that I had some pretty weird music opinions back in those days that I look back on as being kinda dumb. And what did I think about Blink back then? I just really disliked all the small things and thought the band was overhyped to the point of unironically believing they weren't true punk or whatever.
Would you jump into the punk scene saying, "Hey guys, my favorite punk band is Blink-182. I'm a punk rocker too now"? No, because punk fans would laugh at you.
While working on this video and trying to put myself back in the mind of my high school self, that's all I think it really boiled down to. And if you couldn't tell already, it feels really embarrassing to say out loud. As I've said a number of times throughout the video, I'm still not the hugest on all the small things, and it's probably my least favorite track on Enema of the State. But at the end of the day, it's only one song, and I wouldn't say it's 100% representative of Blink's sound or their discography. Even 2013 Shades was aware of how faulty this logic was, even if Blink wasn't mentioned in that video. I've outlined throughout this video many other songs that are more interesting and engaging musically that I'm happy to have become acquainted with, especially with regards to that true punk crap that's definitely antithetical to the original message of this channel. Like,
oh, saying glam metal, nu metal, and metalcore aren't true metal is dumb, but you're perfectly fine saying Blink-182 aren't true punk? What do you know?
Really though, that sentiment pretty much translates to, at best, only being familiar with the singles, and at worst, not knowing the existence of Cheshire Cat or even Dude Ranch. Either way, it reeks of ignorance because those albums are not only the most in line with real punk rock Blink have been, but they establish their credibility as punk rock musicians. They may be pretty boys, but it's not like there's some industry plant boy band passing themselves off as a punk band. What I remember about calling the band overglorified was thinking that the musicianship wasn't anything special at all. Even despite viewing him as the main talent of the band, I especially felt that Travis Barker was getting way more praise for his drumming than I thought he deserved, simply because he wasn't Neil Peart, may God rest his soul, or Chris Adler, or Mike Portnoy, or Chad Smith, or Abe Cunningham, or even Trey Cool. Looking back, I think a lot about this mindset boiled down to pop punk and punk in general not really being my thing at the time. I also see it as evident of me perhaps being too up to my neck in metal, which I also discussed in the Just Enjoy Music video, and perhaps expecting too much from musicians, seeing as how I was comparing Travis to drummers that aren't known for even playing in the same genre he does. Once again, even 2013 Shades was catching on to how shallow this thought process was, so it was only natural that the seed would get planted for me to reevaluate my perception of Blink-182. One big reason I'm glad I went to college and had the experiences I did there is because the culture I was involving myself with there was a significant contributing factor for pop punk and punk in general to become my thing. Today, I consider pop punk to be one of my main favorite genres of music, along with progressive rock and metal, alternative metal, instrumental guitar music, and of course, glam metal. We can't forget about that. Obviously, you have no obligation to like a band just because they popularized or created a genre or influenced bands you like, which is yet another thing 2013 Shades was aware of. But there comes a point where you need to ask yourself why it is this isn't a band you're into when you clearly enjoy the style. And that's another big thing that pushed me in the direction of changing my mind about Blink, especially when you take into account the multitude of third wave pop punk bands that take prominent influence from Blink, whether in terms of songwriting, musicianship, or both. To explain what I mean by that, I like to look at pop punk through different eras. As I said way back earlier in this video, I like to think of pop punk really starting in the early 90s, and that up to about 2005 is what I consider to be the first wave of pop punk, though some consider the first half of the 2000s, the TRL core, to be a separate wave from the 90s. But you get the idea, the first wave is where the de facto classics are. The second wave, to me, is what's commonly dubbed the neon pop punk era of the mid to late 2000s, with bands like Mayday Parade, All Time Low, You Me at 6, Hit the Lights, Halifax, Cartel, The Academy Is, We the Kings, and probably the most popular of this era, Paramore. The third wave consists of all the bands that came on the scene in the 2010s, especially in the Tumblr era. Bands like The Story So Far, Neck Deep, Real Friends, Knuckle Puck, Water Parks, Trash Boat, Trophy Eyes, Belmont, Man Overboard, Like Pacific, Joyce Manor, and my personal favorite, State Champs. And the fourth wave is basically anything from the current decade, particularly bands that got popular through TikTok like Magnolia Park and Meet Me at the Altar. I'd say the first wave is the best, but the third wave is arguably my favorite, as those are all bands I've developed a particular fondness for that I was really happy to see become popular in the last decade, and have so much room to grow even further. Those bands from the third wave take varying degrees of influence from the likes of Newfound Glory, Sum 41, Yellowcard, and even Paramore. But I think the most prominent influence on that era, more than anyone else, even Green Day, was Blink-182. Even if they didn't define the sound, they defined the lifestyle. They defined the craft. They defined the image. They embodied and continue to embody so much about what makes pop punk so awesome. Ask any band or any fan of the genre who their top bands or biggest musical influences are, and Blink will likely be among the first names mentioned. Are they my favorite?
No.
I'm not sure they'd even crack my personal top 10, so I guess I contradicted that last statement. But Blink's impact and influence is undeniable. Even if they aren't a favorite of yours, like the case with me, there's no denying what it was that made them important. And more than anything else, that's the big thing I and many other people appreciate about Blink-182. When I think about bands I used to not like that my opinion ended up turning around on, Blink-182 are one of the first that come to mind, and I'm really happy that's the case. So now here's the part at the end of the video where I ask you, the viewer, what's wrong with Blink-182? Please be rational when leaving your thoughts in the comments below, and by that I mean saying more than just everything. Thank you for watching this video, take care, and have a nice day. I'm Shades, and I'll see you next time.